It's not opening. There we go. So welcome everyone to our presentation, and our presentation is on domestic violence and intimate partner violence among military families. And my name is Justina. I am a graduate student at the Chicago School. I'm in my third year, currently one class away from graduation. I'm in my second class of fieldwork. And my co-presenters are Jennifer Toof and Dr. Heather Trepal, who is the ACA president. Jen, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. So I'm Jen. I am, like Justina, I'm also wrapping up my graduate education at the Chicago School with the Clinical Mental Health Counseling Program. I am also the student chair for the virtual conference, so if you have any questions at all or you want to give us any feedback, I would love that. I'll put my email in the chat box. And I'm really proud to introduce our next co-presenter, and just to be sharing presentation space with the ACA president. So on that note, I'll turn it over to Dr. Trepal.
Hi, thank you. Can you guys hear me? This is my first time doing this in this kind of format. So thank you to Justina and Jennifer. Congratulations almost on your graduations for inviting me to co-present with you. My name is Heather Trepal. I am a professor at the University of Texas at San Antonio, where I coordinate the Clinical Mental Health Counseling Program. And some of my research and consultation is also with law enforcement and first responders on sexual and gender-based violence. And so we're really excited to present for you all today.
So I just have a question for everyone that's watching this presentation. So in terms of military families and domestic violence and intimate partner violence, in regards to stigma, why is this topic important? And you can just type in the chat box. No takers.
Ashley wrote, it seems that intimate partner violence and domestic violence are ignored with this group. See, now their slides are rolling in. Julie said domestic violence is prevalent in the military communities. Melissa, no one should suffer in silence. Ashley, so learning more about it would be insightful. To add on to her original comment. Nothing's going to change if it's not brought to life. Carrie, Ashley said it allows to see how it affects different groups in the military community. Kimberly said it's important and necessary because this population is often ignored and fear is prevalent by practitioners and service members. Wondering how this might manifest given the training of those in the military. Veronica and Ashley said, I think shedding light on the subject. I feel that it is prevalent, but due to military culture, it might not be reported as often, and we're absolutely going to get into, I think, all of those points, and particularly stigma on both sides, whether it's stigma that military members have, biases about counseling, or whether it's the counselors themselves. What biases do they hold toward this population?
So like Jen said, we're going to talk about all of that, because there are still many stigmas within this population regarding mental health services. And I intern on a college campus, and even on a large college campus with veterans, some veterans, instead of coming into the office that I work out of, they'll like slyly come and talk to me as I'm walking to the water dispenser to fill my water bottle and say, hey, you know, I'm like dealing with this and this, just because the stigmas are so real, and you know, they don't want people to think that they're crazy or that they can't manage your job, because in the military, within that culture, if you perceive yourself to be a person who is unstable or unable to do your job, I don't want to say that everybody will turn against you, but that's kind of how that culture works. So it's important to understand that when thinking about this population. And many individuals who experience domestic violence and intimate partner violence don't really know how to report it or who to report it to, because within different battalions and different units, the person you're supposed to report it to, that person kind of changes all the time, and there's not really like a set guideline. And sometimes even when reports are made, nothing happens. So the learning objectives for this presentation today is to be able to describe factors that contribute to domestic violence and intimate partner violence in military families, and understand what makes military families high risk. And also to be able to identify barriers that military families face when seeking mental health services, and how military culture plays an active role. And then the last one is to be able to identify common biases that counselors have toward the military populations, and biases that the military population has towards seeking mental health services. So this is just some statistics that I found regarding domestic violence and intimate partner violence. So over 67% of female service members who are married to a civilian male spouse reported having a higher rate of depression compared to those who reported not experiencing intimate partner violence. And over 40% of female veterans reported experiencing intimate partner violence and also having a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. 50% of female patients at a VA reported having a dual diagnosis of alcohol abuse and depression, or post-traumatic stress disorder. And in terms of military families, they're very high risk for domestic violence and intimate partner violence compared to civilian families, because they live in a culture where there are many, many different stressors. Stressors like family separation, deployments, combat-related injuries, being medically retired when you originally thought that you were going to be a career, or like have a career being in the military, having mental health disorders such as anxiety or depression, substance use, drinking is very common, smoking cigarettes or using dip is very common in the military culture, having combat experience or combat exposure, because there are some veterans that I used to work with that were exposed to combat the entire duration of their deployment, and they were overseas serving in either Iraq or Afghanistan for at least 7 months, and it was just constant combat exposure. It was like every single day something new happened. And sometimes they experience financial hardships too, because one of my good friends is actually, he was enlisted in the military, and he told me that when he left the military, when he left the Marine Corps as a corporal, he only got paid, I think, a little bit over $16,000. And that's not a lot of money, especially when you're thinking about all the other expenses that comes into play. And child abuse is also very present, along with domestic violence and intimate partner violence. And in over 55% of cases, the perpetrator is an active duty male service member. And there's not a lot of research regarding this aspect when it comes to veterans who are males instead of active duty. And reporting domestic violence and intimate partner violence brings a lot of guilt and shame, because it really goes against the military culture. Because in the military, you know, you're supposed to be stoic, you're supposed to be strong, there's like a lot of patriotism and altruism involved. And sometimes family members just aren't properly informed of the procedures. And like I said earlier, they don't know who to go to if something happens, because that's not something that they tell you right off the bat. You kind of have to search for it on your own. So in terms of the emotional cycle of deployment, there's basically 5 phases to this. There's the pre-deployment phase, the deployment phase, adjustment, pre-reunion, and post-deployment. And in the pre-deployment phase, it's kind of like you're anticipating leaving. Sometimes you might be in denial, and then it's kind of like you're mentally and physically distancing because you're preparing to leave. And in the deployment, there's a lot of loneliness and sadness, and sometimes the person might feel overwhelmed with responsibilities, because going back to the example that I gave of my friend and how he got paid around like 16,000, he had a responsibility of 4 other members of his squad. So, I mean, he was, I think, maybe 20 years old at the time. He was in an infantry battalion, so he was in charge of 4 other people, and it's not like it is. Those 4 other people's lives depended on him and how well he did his job. And if he didn't do his job well, then that could potentially mean that one of those 4 people didn't come home. And that was what happened. And he struggled with that a lot because one of those 4 people didn't make it back home. So in the adjustment phase, it's where, you know, there's established independence and confidence increases, and this can be either the service member or the spouse or partner. So the pre-reunion includes anticipation and excitement, and some apprehension of returning because they don't really know what's going on. And then the post-deployment part includes kind of like a honeymoon period where there's reintegration and negotiations of routines. So I have a question, and I'm wondering which phase within this cycle do you think that the highest rates of domestic violence and intimate partner violence occurs? And you can just write that in the chat box. So
We're
I'm
getting
seeing
a range of answers here.
I'm getting a lot of orange dots on my screen.
Oh, sure. So I love when it moves so fast that I can barely keep up with it. It means people are writing. So Caitlin said when they come home, which would be adjustment. We have a lot of post-deployment answers. Another adjustment, post. So we're getting, a pre. So it looks like some of the thoughts are all over the board.
Yes, so the research actually supports that it's the post-deployment. And I think this is really interesting because in my experience working with this population, it's actually the pre-deployment where that's kind of the highest rate of domestic violence and intimate partner violence, because the veterans I used to work with, they were very young when they got into relationships where they were married, and there was a lot of trauma, a lot of anger, a lot of distrust. So the rates of domestic violence and intimate partner violence actually went up during that time, because a lot of the male veterans that I used to work with were very distrusting of their spouses or significant others during that pre-deployment phase because they didn't know what was going to happen. And that was during a specific time, during the time that we were deploying to Iraq, and kind of like the switch between Iraq and Afghanistan. So at that time, we were sending more troops over to Afghanistan that haven't been there for a while. So they knew that the potential of them not coming home was very, very high. So that kind of elevated the stress. But the research actually supports the post-deployment phase. So military culture. I think a lot of people, when working with this population, they forget that military is a culture, and it's kind of like a way of life, so to speak. And each branch is kind of like a mini culture within that way of life, just because they're so different. So military culture is an important factor to consider because, you know, in terms of mental health and seeking mental health services and really just kind of talking to people about your feelings or whatever, it goes against cultural values. Like I said earlier, you know, you might be viewed by your peers as weak. And if you're in a unit where, you know, you might be like in a special forces unit, or you might be in an infantry unit where your job or like the lives of the people that are in your unit depend on how well you do your job. And if you're struggling with anxiety, or if you're struggling with depression, or you might be one of those people where at the time you didn't care whether, you know, you lived or you died, that affects everybody else, because it's kind of like a domino effect. So everybody has to be on the same page. And military culture promotes a lot of substance use and a lot of anger. They always say that it's funny because the military teaches you that it's not okay to be angry, but then anger is kind of like one of the norms when you're in the military. And violence, which, you know, substance use, anger, and violence are all contributing factors to domestic violence and intimate partner violence, not just in military culture, but in general. And reporting a case of domestic violence or intimate partner violence could tarnish a service member's career in some cases. And that's why a lot of significant others and a lot of spouses, and I don't want to use the term cover it up, but they're not as forthcoming about some of the struggles that their partner is struggling with. And sometimes, even though they report it, it might not be taken seriously by the service member's chain of command. So it really depends on how good their chain of command is, because I've worked with clients that have reported these situations and nothing happened. And then I really want to highlight this in terms of family members not having like proper protocol, because I know in certain units, depending on what branch you are, there's like a family readiness officer, or I'm not sure exactly like what all the specific terms are depending on all the branches, but usually you would assume that you would go to that person, but sometimes that's not the case, and they refer you to like someone who specializes in mental health, and then that kind of gets lost in all the red tape and nothing happens. And then individuals who do report might also face backlash from their community. Wives and spouses or partners might face, I guess, how do I term this? They might be outcasted by the military community, or like the military spouse or partner community, only because they view that as like you being a traitor, basically. Like, I can't believe you reported this, even though, you know, you have every right to report it. And individuals, like I said, might be viewed as less than or weak. Dr. Trepal, can turn this over to you.
Thank you. So Justina has been talking about the military culture and some various aspects of domestic violence, interpartner violence within the military culture. But as counselors, as we all probably know, our core curriculum doesn't do a great job in laying out training about this topic. And so we need to unpack the rates of domestic violence and interpersonal violence in the civilian population, which we know are quite high. But interpersonal violence and domestic violence are complex issues. And so for counselors, you know, we need to untangle those definitions and elements of patterns of violence in relationships in many forms: emotional, physical, sexual neglect. When domestic violence was first theorized, it was conceptualized as unidirectional. So it was, used to hear terms such as wife battering, battered wife system. It was one way, men being violent towards women. And gender played into this early conceptualization with statistics on men being more likely to commit violent crimes such as rape, stalking, or physical assault at higher rates than women. Thus, focusing on women might be seen as victim blaming. Also, early studies didn't focus on relationships that weren't heterosexual, and cultural differences were also not studied as widely. But over the past 20 to 30 years, the gender asymmetry of domestic violence and interpersonal violence has been challenged. So as counselors, we have to, and we're going to move on to talking about stigma and counselors within the military population, but we do have to think of sort of what do we know about that? And so as research has looked at different things, one of them is directionality. And so unidirectional from one person to the other, or bidirectional interpersonal violence. So violence that's between a couple in a relationship. And so here are some statistics from a meta review of different studies. And it talks about just some things that counselors may want to be aware of in the civilian population. You know, males having higher rates of bidirectional violence, higher rates of domestic violence, interpartner violence among African American couples. Mutual violent control has low rates around couples. We also have more than one type of domestic violence, interpersonal violence in the literature. The type that we most commonly think of has been called intimate terrorism. And so it's about coercive control tactics involving, you know, any combination of physical or sexual violence with a variety of nonviolent controls, economic abuse, emotional abuse, use of children, threats of intimidation, blaming the victim, threatening to report to immigration authorities or to out a person to work or family is what we call intimate terrorism. So when you see that in the literature, or hear that, you know what that's kind of referring to. A second form is called violent resistance, and that's where with individual becoming attacked becomes resistance. So many who are victims who have experienced intimate terrorism do respond in some ways with violence of their own. And the third type is situational couple violence, which is less known in the literature, but where things sort of erupt in a couple relationship. Justina, could you flip it on to the next slide? Thanks. Some things also to help unpack in looking at domestic violence and intimate partner violence among the civilian population, gender and gender theory plays a big role in this. And so sort of as counselors to think about what are our preconceived notions about violence between genders. So thinking about values, attitudes, physical attributes. Also thinking about the different types of relationships where people might be involved in with domestic violence and intimate partner violence. And then looking at arrest policies. All state laws are different and have evolved over time, but sometimes that also plays into it, how law enforcement make judgments about who to remove from a situation of domestic violence. And sometimes their stereotypes, again, and their own thoughts and backgrounds can play into that. And then finally, looking at the types of things that may contribute or be contributing factors to domestic violence or interpersonal partner violence. The literature has looked at child abuse, alcohol abuse, witnessing domestic violence growing up, or history of being physically abused, may all put people at a risk of increasing domestic or interpersonal violence as they become adults and navigate into different relationships.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about the stigma related to seeking mental health treatment in general. And this is going to touch on what Justina was talking about earlier, the stigma that exists. There's a lot of barriers to seeking help in the military, just like there's a lot of barriers to seeking help in the general population. The military has some specific barriers here, and that can include the stigma. It can also include a fear of impact on their career, matters around confidentiality. Fear of a loss of housing, that kind of goes into the logistical issues. So what actually will happen? Where can I go? How do I do this if I seek help? And the fear of the loss of the military sense of community, that military culture. This is my family. Military is a family unit. And if I am no longer a part of this, then I'm losing my family. So I want to go back to that stigma. A quarter to 2/5 of those in the military with mental health problems endorse anticipated stigma as a factor that might affect their decision to seek help for mental health issues. And this statistic was true across countries, across cultures, across branch of service, whether they were veterans, current or former service members. Their biggest issue one issue that they mentioned was stigma. the anticipated stigma. And I put this at the bottom of the slide, but it's important to know, although these veterans are concerned about the negative perceptions if they were to seek treatment, a much smaller number of them endorsed that they would judge a fellow veteran negatively in a similar situation. And a very small percentage actually experienced any negative career impact from seeking services. So, I want us to think about that for a minute, because we can relate that to many forms of negative forecasting, of these cognitive distortions or these biases that we might hold. If I do this, this is definitely going to happen, and maybe in most cases it doesn't. So the most endorsed stigma concerns were my unit leadership might treat me differently. I would be seen as weak. My unit members will have less confidence in me if I seek help for a mental health problem. Back to that concept of being weak, we have these militarized constructions of masculinity, strength, the ability to overcome adversity on their own. Service members are expected to be tough, to shut down their feelings, much like men in our society, in American society, in general, we don't expect them to cry or to talk about their problems. We want them to be tough, to shut down their feelings. Just keep working. Do what you're supposed to do your best for our country. Cope on your own with any difficult emotion you're experiencing. And the stigma concern about being seen as weak for seeking help, it might be an extremely ingrained belief associated, like I said, with the masculine culture of military culture. These concerns persist even after individuals have left service. And just going back real quick, if we think of where PTSD stemmed from, it was first called being shell-shocked, right, which came from military culture, and people who had this condition, they were seen as something's terribly wrong with them. They shouldn't have been in the service to begin with. This is a weakness. And some of that has changed. A lot of that has thankfully changed, but still that stigma exists. Justina, you can go to the next slide. Okay, so why don't the wives or the partners seek help? Well, very similar reasons, but military wives might not seek treatment if they are the victims, because they think they too need to be stoic, strong, and consistently support their partner's military career. That's what they have been told their role is. I am supportive. I am a military wife or a military partner, and I go with the flow. It's my partner's career above all. So if I seek treatment or I make this concern public, that would be me not fulfilling my duty as a military partner. Nearly 60% of respondents in a survey gave that as one of or as the single reason why they did not seek help after experiencing domestic violence or intimate partner violence. Peter put in the chat, I would hate to think that to have that mentality, you mean? Yeah. And Justina just wrote, individuals also don't seek treatment if their partner identifies as LGBTQ. They're fearful that they'll be targeted and their partner will lose their job. Absolutely. All the shame, all the ingrained beliefs about this is what I should be, this is how I should respond. And Carrie said it's isolating. In a field that's already isolated, like Savannah saying, because they're moving constantly. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so we talked about, ingrained beliefs that members of the military and their partners may have, but let's face the fact that mental health providers may have their own biases towards the military population. Counselors are certainly not immune to biases, and you might share some of these same beliefs about military members seeking help. If you have a military man come in your office and he looks very physically strong, you might think he's supposed to be strong. Okay, if he comes in here with a mental health concern, How is he going to be able to protect my country? So we might have these thoughts that they are not as capable of their jobs because of whatever, is whatever mental health issues they're struggling with. Counselors who haven't served in the military themselves, and even those who have, should be aware of the potential stereotype. And I'll add, counselors who haven't served in the military might not understand military culture and understand, the specific issues, the specific beliefs. Just like with any cultural group, we have to work to continually educate ourselves and be aware of others' beliefs and worldviews. Exposure to negative and inaccurate portrayals of veterans in movies and other forms of media, that's inevitable. That can create bias. I can think of a lot of movies and examples of media that shows, veterans with PTSD or other issues. I'm thinking of This Is Us. Anybody watch This Is Us? With Jack's brother, who has PTSD, and he's kind of cranky, and he throws the chair through the window in the season. Good show. But and some of these potential stereotypes and inaccurate beliefs include the thought that all veterans returning from a combat zone have seen combat, that all Marines have killed, that all military wives are stay-at-home mothers, that all enlisted troops are without a college degree, that all clients with nightmares have post-traumatic stress disorder. I think that's a big one too. If you're working with a military member and they come in, and they say, I'm having nightmares, are you jumping right to, that's PTSD? I know it must be PTSD because that's what I see in TV and media because you're a veteran. That all troops have been deployed overseas. And most importantly, that all counselors are smarter, wealthier, classier, and more educated or better adjusted than their military clients. We should not have that belief in general about any group of clients. So self-awareness, consistent self-monitoring on the part of the counselor are vital to combat these biases and stereotypes. This one mine too, Justina? Okay. So military service, why is this group at such high risk for domestic violence and intimate partner violence? Well, military service has really unique psychological, social, and environmental factors that can contribute to this elevated risk. Multiple deployments, family separation, and reintegration, that cycle that Justina put up, that picture in the beginning when you're cycling through, now they're leaving, now they're coming back, now I'm adjusting to this, now I'm adjusting to this. Are they coming back? When are they coming back? Demanding workloads at home and while on duty. Histories of head trauma. There are unprecedented levels of TBI, traumatic brain injury, which increase the likelihood of aggression and impulsivity in the military population. And mental illness, such as PTSD, but not limited to PTSD, and substance abuse. But let's go back to PTSD for a second. So veterans with PTSD, they're significantly more likely to perpetrate violence toward their partners, with over 60%, and very small on my screen, 80% committing at least one act of violence in the previous year, and almost half at least one severe act, including strangulation, stabbing, and even shooting. A Pentagon report from 2011 found that soldiers with PTSD are up to 3 times more likely to be aggressive with their female partners than those without such trauma. 3 times more likely. The stigma related to military personnel seeking mental health treatment perpetuates this cycle of violence. So if you're not getting treatment, the systems persist or they worsen, the stress persists and worsens, and the unhealthy coping mechanisms to deal with that stress worsens and continues.
So Jen, before we move to the next slide, so Caitlin, I'm sorry, I'm gonna call you out for a second. If I could do that to you and Sherry for a little bit, because I know that you're both I think, Sherry, you're still in the military, right? Okay. So in terms of like demanding workloads and like being on duty, can you help us describe what that looks like how many hours you would have to work and what you're doing?
It actually depends on your location. There's no work schedule per se, so there's no particular set hours in a 24-hour day period. Normally you start around 4:30, 5:30 in the morning. When you're done, depends on what the operation looks like. What I mean by that is, could be 2,200, could be 10, could be 11. So there's no set hours. And as far as to break periods, there's truly no what we call take a break. It's more or less, eat during your time frame, and then we have to make sure that operations continue throughout the day.
Thank you for sharing that. Caitlin, you're here somewhere on my screen. I'm sorry, can't see you.
While we're waiting for Caitlin, I'm answering Carrie's question in the chat box, but Carrie asked about CEs. The information's on the last page of the conference program. You just complete the evaluation for each presentation you attend. You have to attend it in full. And it was Jody actually that asked that. Jody, you have to make sure that your full name is present in Zoom because we can't verify attendance with just a first name. So you have to change your name in Zoom.
So Laylee mentioned that she thinks that language can be a barrier, especially if the spouse has not lived independently before they were married. And that's a really good point, especially since I know a lot of service members, they might get married outside of the US, and then when they come back, their spouse really kind of it's like a new culture to them basically because they moved to a different country, and language could be a really big barrier in addition to just getting acclimated to new surroundings, making friends, having a support system, people that you can turn to. And let's see, and then Miriam said that long-term service also affects them, and it's very true. So I used to work with a veteran that served 13 tours, 10 of them were combat tours, and he broke his back during one of his tours. To what he says was a rookie mistake because he was a corpsman in the Navy, and he was attached to a Marine unit. And he said that he broke his back during an IED, and instead of running straight to the casualty, he ran behind the Humvee for cover, and that's when he was injured. And from all the Marines that I've worked with and all the combat veterans that I've worked with, they always say that if your corpsman or your medic gets injured, then that puts you in a really, really bad situation, because if anybody gets injured, you better hope that it's not your corpsman and it's not your medic, because those are the people that treat the injured. Let's see. Does anyone have any questions for us?
Yeah, I'd love to get some more thoughts and feedback. There was so much going on in the chat, and I probably wasn't able to catch it all, but there were some good points. Feel free to come on video, to come on mute and share any of your own thoughts.
I do have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
And this is not, your presentation was fabulous, but I came in right when it had already started, so I don't know how, are we receiving our CEU credits for this?
So I put that information in the chat box. If you go to the program,
Okay.
the link to the program, on the very last page, or right near the last page, there's information about CEs, and there's a link to an evaluation. So you click on that evaluation. You don't have to do it now, but you do have to do it before April 19th. So for every presentation you attend, fill out that evaluation. You know, give us some time to work on getting the CEs distributed, and we also have to verify attendance. So that's why it's important. You know, I was telling Jody to make sure to put your full name in Zoom. How you do that, by the way, if you're on your laptop or a computer, you go to the participant list, hover your mouse over your own name, and you'll see a little blue More button, and then you click on that, and you can see rename.
Okay, well, I can see my full name on.
Yeah, you're good. You're good.
Okay, and you said that the information is in the chat box down here?
Yeah, but it's basically what I just said, and then it's also on the last page of the program.
Oh, okay. Oh, I get it. Okay, I see it here. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Okay.
Are there any other questions for us?
I have a really quick question. Is there any correlation that you might have come across in terms of domestic violence and suicide rates in the military?
That's so funny that you asked that question, because both of those areas are my research interests. So in terms of domestic violence and suicide together, I think it depends on the situation. Because usually what happens is domestic violence and intimate partner violence is very closely correlated with substance use, with anger issues, usually. And I say usually because it's not all cases, that the veteran has a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, and they probably also have a traumatic brain injury. And there's some type of substance involved. If it's not alcohol, then it's marijuana. If it's none of those, then it's like prescribed painkillers like oxys or heroin. Some people have used like methadone and heroin. In terms of suicide, I mean, from my experience working with veterans and some of the veterans that I know that have taken their own lives, they've never, they didn't have good relationships with their spouses or their partners, but it wasn't a domestic violence situation and then they took their own life. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay. Does anyone else have any other questions? I see that Carrie wrote that that is a true statement, but I'm not sure what you're referring to, Carrie.
Must have
been. This is Carrie. It was in reference to some of the comments that Sherry was making in terms of military operations and what a typical day looks like. I was just going to add on and say a lot of times it also depends on your actual job. Being in the Air Force, medical, you know, they may get off at 4, but if you're a crew chief, you may still be on the flight line at 6 o'clock in the evening and you got there at like 6 o'clock. So, but they want those planes to get out there and get those sorties. Sortie is just mean another way of saying flight. So that's what I was referring to.
Okay. Yeah, it really depends on what their job is, and also in the military, and I think I forgot to mention this earlier, is that the good of everybody else always goes before whatever you want to do. So you might want to go home at a specific time because like you might have whatever it is to do, or your child might be sick, but the mission of your unit or your battalion or whatever always goes before like you and your family's needs, basically. Because a lot of the veterans that I work with now, or I used to work with, they worked, I would say, like 18 to 20 hour days, or they might be on duty for like a full week every single day. And like Sherry says, it depends on what happens during that day, because it you know, you could be having an okay day, and then something happens, and then you're at work for the rest of the week, basically. So I see that Carrie says that that seems like that could cause a lot of anger and frustration. Yes, and I guess yes and no, because I work with a lot of Marines, and a lot of them, you know, they do get frustrated, and they complain a lot about all the things that they have to do. And it's really interesting because when they're in the service, they'll complain and they'll complain and they'll complain. And it's, you know, and it seems like they really, really hate their jobs. But then once they leave, once they leave the Marine Corps, it's not that same way. They're like, why did I get out? I was so stupid. I shouldn't have done that. And I don't know, Sherry, maybe you can attest that this is in other branches too, but you're on mute, I can't hear you.
No, you're right. You build resilience, because you have to be cognizant and aware that you're there to save lives. That's your job. That's your role. And when you're in an operations, when you're in Afghanistan, when you're in Iraq, leaving the mission or leaving the operations unattended or not giving it your all during that time period, although it may be long, it's exhausting, but the benefits of saving the host nation lives and American lives outweigh everything. So it's more about the resiliency of it, if that makes sense.
Do we have any other questions or comments?
I'm going to do a quick share screen while we're wrapping up.
Oh, is it for the CEs?
No, the Taveras.
Oh, I forgot about that. Sorry.
That's okay. If it was. Yeah, so we really thank you all for being here. It'll get there. I appreciate you guys attending the conference and being a part of this. It's
What are you screen sharing? Jen, you're frozen on my screen.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, but
Okay.
I can't see your screen.
Okay, let me see. Can you see my screen now?
No, it said that you started your oh, there we go.
Okay. Of course, it's saying my internet connection is unstable. Okay, so we want to thank our sponsor for the virtual conference, Tavera. If you need to take your program online right now, like many people, Tavera is the site to do that. We at the Chicago School use Tavera mostly for tracking fieldwork hours, but also for class assignments. So you can go to Tavera.com and contact them at info@tavera.com. We want to thank Tavera for helping us and being a sponsor.
Anything else? Jen?
I don't think so. Thank you to you. Thank you to Dr. Trepal and everyone for joining us today.
Yes, what she said.
All right, we can stop recording now, Sherry. And thank you, Sherry.